Yes and no. I mean, if he'd been interested in it, we would perhaps also have been surprised. In some ways, it was a very intellectual. You can't say that his keeping his distance from it was because it would have lowered his status. I mean, one of his great contemporaries, Sir James Fraser, who founded anthropology, had to be very careful of being too interested in anthropology when he was asked at high table at Trinity whether he'd ever met a native. He had to think and say, God forbid. Because, I mean, it's all right to write about natives, but to meet a native. And someone might have said, James, I gather you not only write about ghosts, but you spend your time in the evenings dabbling with them. Ha, ha, ha. So, but I think the fact that Sidgwick and a number of very distinguished philosophers and writers and others were members of the society suggests that, he wouldn't have lost face by being a member of it. So it is a bit puzzling. The fact that he didn't take holy orders might be a clue. I think he was ambivalent all his life about whether there was another world, another life, God, so on. He never committed himself. And that is one of the interesting things about the ghost stories, because they take you to the edge of belief, but they don't thrust you into it. So you start always with extreme rationality. Everything is calm and in the light of ordinary day, and then it gets odder and odder, and then you're left. He says, well, you can believe it if you like. And so I think he kept his options open. He was always doubting. Bertrand Russell said the greatest invention of the 20th century was the suspended judgment. And though it wasn't invented then, I think Monty was a great example of the suspended judgment. And I think probably the Society for Psychical Research didn't suspend judgment enough for his point of view. He wasn't sure he believed in that stuff, and he wasn't sure he wanted to start down the track of trying to prove whether it was true or not. These guys can do it if they want. But like the odd people over in the Cavendish laboratory, that's their business, not mine. So he doesn't want to be sucked into that particular whirlpool. I think so, because people might have then said they were some kind of propaganda for the psychical research. Also, there were these scandals. I mean, there was some famous medium, I've forgotten what her name was, who was alluring to all the Cambridge and she was outed. I mean, it was shown that it was a fraud, and Madame Blavatsky and all the rest of it. So I think he was wary, perhaps not rightly, but he was quite wary. I mean, what really interests me about the whole thing is that the movement, psychical research, came out of a real need, which was shown by the fact that A.R. Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution, was also very interested in psychical research. And that is that God is dead. I mean, Darwin has shown that rational people can't really believe in God in the way that they did anyway, according to Richard Dawkins. Therefore, what are we going to do? Is there some other belief system? And it's clear that for Sidgwick and others, psychical research was searching for something other. And I think M.R. James's ghost stories come out of that as another manifestation of it, because for him also God is not clearly alive, and therefore he's a parallel movement to the psychical research, but not exactly the same. But I think another great branch which has always fascinated me is children's stories. I mean, that is the beginning of Alice in Wonderland, and the great tradition, or Beatrix Potter and so on. I mean, that whole fantasy world that ends up with Harry Potter, which is earlier, but makes the late Victorians, the Edwardians in the middle 20th century, the greatest period of children's story writing that the world's perhaps ever known, and in this country and in England. It's all part of trying to find an alternative parallel reality which human beings need, because we cannot live by either bread or the daily boring material world that surrounds us. Human beings are above all imaginative creatures, and they can't live just by reading newspapers and plodding around. They have to create Miyazaki fantasy Japanese type worlds in parallel with this one. And some do it with games, some do it with novels, some do it with television, and some do it with ghost stories.